Now, I'm going to read you a passage from the chapter called From Maternity to Old Age. The individual life history of women, because she is still bound up in her female functions, depends in much greater degree than that of man upon her physiological destiny, and the curve of this destiny is much more uneven, more discontinuous than the masculine curve. Each period in the life of women is uniform and monotonous, but the transitions from one stage to another are dangerously abrupt. They are manifested by crises, puberty, sexual initiation, the menopause, which are very much decisive than in the male. Whereas man grows old gradually, women is suddenly deprived of their femininity. She is still relatively young when she loses the erotic attractiveness and the fertility, which in the view of society and her own provide justification for existence and her opportunity for happiness. With no future, she has one half of her life to live. Now, I do not see the world that way. I think women are every bit as responsible for themselves as men are. Now, I must admit, I didn't necessarily think that as a young man. But what really did it for me was the birth of my granddaughter. I never had my own daughter. I had a son. But when my granddaughter came along, I thought, doggone it, I hope nobody tells her what to do. She's got to make her own decisions. That's it. I'm going to encourage her to read Simone as soon as she gets old enough. Now, I'm going to take a short break and tell you a little more about my granddaughter. I recited a Robert Frost poem to her. Whose woods these are, I think I know, but the man is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping to watch the snow. My little horse must think it queer to pass without a farmhouse near. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And she said, Grandpa, say that again. So I did. And she says, I know who that is. I said, who? Santa Claus. I now take that as the definitive definition of that Robert Frost poem. Now, being in nothingness. I really do think that Nausea, that novel, anticipated being in nothingness because he repeats ideas that came from his novel. And that's what got him going for that particular thing. Now, oh yes, okay. Now, this play by Sartre, No Exit. I once, when I was still teaching full-time, I got a grant, and I wrote a short play called late night at Les Deux Magots. That's a bar in Paris where Jean-Paul and Simone used to go to. And anyway, no exit. The character, it's a very brief play. There are only 3 people in it. There are only 3 people in my play. Jean-Paul, Simone, and a bartender. But in this play, no exit. Where would you be if you had no exit? There's an exit right here. There's exits in your car. There are exits in your house. Where would you be if there's no exit?
Outside.
Pardon?
Outside.
Outside. You said outside.
Well, actually, the play is set in hell. Not that John Paul believed in hell, but he was writing fiction. So these 3 people are in hell, and in hell, there's no exit. Sometimes Sartre sounds very negative, like writing a book called Nausea and writing something called Being in Nothingness. But he didn't behave like that. He was always positive because he wanted freedom, not just for himself, but for everybody. That's why he lost friends when they disagreed with him, and that was okay with him. Now, I may not have mentioned this book before, but it's called Sex and Philosophy. Sounds like an odd title for a book, isn't it? But it's the rethinking of de Beauvoir and Sartre. And if you only read if you're only going to read one thing, don't read Being in Nothingness. It's so complicated. But existentialism and humanism is readable. But this is fascinating. You ought to take a look at it. Sex and Philosophy, about the 2 of them. Now, okay. How many of you have questions before I go on? Is there something I went by too quickly? You want me to repeat something? Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you just define in a sentence what existentialism is?
I'm sorry?
Could you define very, very briefly what existentialism is?
What existentialism is?
Yeah.
Well, I'll do so, but I'm going to quote Simone too, because when she was asked that question, she said nothing, because it takes too long. But if you had to define existentialism simply, it would be believing that existence precedes essence, because that's the key to human action, because we have to take responsibility for ourselves. And as much as possible, our responsibility for others. If that's the simplest definition I can give.
Yes, sir.
Is there a little
little bit of a contradiction between Sartre's embrace of Marxism, even if it was brief, and his tendency towards socialist views and existentialism.
I'm sorry?
Is there a contradiction between Sartre's embrace of Marxism, which is very deterministic,
Oh,
and his leaning towards more socialistic philosophies, and his belief in existentialism? And how did he reconcile that?
well, that's a very good question. He was attracted to Marxism because it was for the lower classes. And to John Paul, that was very important. But when he saw that the Marxists from Russia were taking over other countries, he said, whoa, I can't go with that. I'm not a fellow traveler.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he gave it up. But it's like all of us. At some point, we change our mind. We think one thing is right, but we realize it isn't. So you have to change. And that's what Sartre did. He took action, which is his whole point. And taking action is the most critical thing about existentialism. You can't just sit on your ass. Excuse me. I didn't mean to say something scandalous, like the write-up says. Now, speaking of scandalous, as you know, Simone, when she visited the United States in the early 50s, and I told you that she was asked about existentialism, and she wouldn't answer because it takes too long. But that was when she met Nelson Algren. And the beginning of their affair was not too far from here. It was on the beach in Indiana, which isn't far from here at all. When you go towards Chicago, you pass through Indiana, and it has a small area on the beach. Now, a few years ago, my wife and I went there and found the place. And we said, okay, this is where it happened. At least this is where it started. Now, interestingly enough, when Nelson Algren went to Paris to visit Simone, Jean Paul was there, and he met him and welcomed him and said, oh, okay, good. Mr. Algren, nice to meet you. Please come join us. They had no problem whatsoever with sleeping with other people. That's why the word scandalous is in this description. And they both did. Now, why Simone did that, I don't know. But she was with Nelson on and off for 15 years. Now, Nelson Algren died when he was 72. Jean Paul died when he was 75. Simone died when she was 78. These people all drank heavily and all smoked heavily. You don't live long doing that. And a couple times, Sartre had collapsed, and his doctor said, quit drinking, quit smoking. He could never do it. That's why he died at 75. Same reason for Algren. But somehow Simone survived to 78. Now, in Paris, Jean Paul and Simone are buried in a common tomb. That doesn't happen all the time, but it did for those two, because despite so many things, They stayed together. They were together for over 50 years. Both of them adopted daughters. They didn't have any children themselves. And one book says, why? They should have passed their genes on. But you know what? Existence precedes essence. You can't pass genes on along, according to Sartre. You create yourself. But both their daughters were very interested in what they were thinking. And it went on and on. And I think those two girls are still alive. I always wanted to meet one of them. I may go to Paris and find them, but we'll see. Now, I've read you passages for being in nothingness. I've read you passages from the second sex. I talked about the ethics of ambiguity. I talked about nausea, being in nothingness, no exit. Now I want to go back to one thing. A lot of what Sartre said is based on Descartes. You know this famous line, I think, therefore I am. Now Sartre took that and made a big deal of it. And Descartes believed in systematic doubt. If there is a possibility of doubt, then doubt. If there's no possibility of doubt, believe. But if there is any possibility of doubt, then doubt. And Sartre took that and extended it considerably. Are there any other questions? Okay. Now, I want to read you just a couple of lines from Simone's The Mandarins. Just a couple. Kind of starting in the middle here, but don't bother. I don't want one. Dubilla finished hanging the clusters of pimentos came down from the stairs. They're decorating for Christmas. Not bad, he said, examining his work with a critical eye. He went over to the table and opened a small bag of spices. For years, on the slightest excuse, he had been connecting that same punch, the recipe for which he had learned in Haiti. Leaning against the railing, Nadine was chewing one of the pimentos. At 18, in spite of her experiences in various French and American beds, she still seemed to be the middle of this awkward age. That's Simone herself. And it goes on, and you can tell as you read that who Jean Paul is, who Simone is, who Nelson Algren is, and who Albert Camus is. And this is, aside from the second sex, which is infinitely complex, I would recommend reading The Mandarins. Personally, I think she's a better writer than Sartre. Sartre tries to make things as difficult as possible. Simone just tries to tell a story, and she does it well. And I think she's very, very much worth reading. Now, like I said, every lecture I've been here before this has been about one religion or another. But this is not. This is about atheism. And how do you get by with it? You get by the way Jean-Paul said. Action. And if you do believe in God, then go ahead. But Jean-Paul could not. He admitted that others might, but he could not. And Simone, once in a while, suggested that there is a God. But she and Jean-Paul talked all the time about everything. And probably at some level she was an atheist. But nonetheless, she still brought it up. So did Jean-Paul, like I said. And being in nothingness, he said if God exists, he's contingent on people's beliefs, but not his. Okay? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Okay, are there, young man, do you have any questions?
I understand that Simone and Jean-Paul had a very close relationship, despite several outside interests that they pursued with other people. There's also some sense in history that Simone may have actually encouraged John Paul to engage in other extracurricular activities. Is there any truth to that?
Yes. If he wanted to. And he felt exactly the same way. That's why he welcomed Nelson Algren when he came to Paris. And if Simone was talking to Simone about somebody, she'd say, go ahead. That's it. Keep it simple, make it fun. According to them.
I see. Thank you.
Yes.
What do you think Simone would think of the current Me Too movement?
I'm sorry?
What do you think Simone would think of the current Me Too movement?
Of Miss?
Me Too. The recent, the last year or so, all of the women have come forward with sexual allegations, scandalous, allegations against their male counterparts.
What would Simone think?
Yes.
Put him in jail. That's exactly what Simone would think. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Now, if somebody does something willingly, that's totally different. But if somebody is molested, shoot him. Shoot the molester or put him away. And actually, interestingly enough, Jean-Paul would say the same thing. Now, sometimes Jean-Paul was referred to as a male chauvinist pig. But Simone didn't think so. Simone didn't think so at all. He's my friend. He's my associate. We discuss ideas. He's not a pig. I behave the same way. Yes.
You probably know about the Book of Letters, that they're letters about the life in Indiana, in Miller Beach.
Yes.
I can't remember the name of it, but the letters I think are all Simone's. But the book is fascinating. It's
Oh,
wonderful.
Simone's letters?
Yes, I can't, does anybody know the name of it?
Yes,
Or-
I have a
you know?
copy of
Okay.
that. And what I find fascinating about that book, these are all letters written to Jean Paul.
Yes, I think the other ones just disappeared, I think.
Yes,
So,
but she refers to Jean Paul as the little one. If he's under 5 feet tall, if she's 5'2", he's the little one. Now, Jean Paul recalled her Le Castor, which means the beaver, because she worked so hard. So they had cute little names for one another. The little one, and that apparently did not bother Jean Paul. And the beaver didn't bother her. She did work hard, as did he. And yes, those letters are fascinating and should tell them the truth. They always told the truth to one another. It was a non-issue. Whether or not they ever lied to themselves, I rather doubt it. But as you know, Sartre pointed out, that's bad faith. Lying to yourself. Admit it. How many of you have ever seen that book about Simone's letters to Jean Paul? I should have brought the copy with me to show you. It's fascinating. Again, it's easier to understand than reading The Second Sex or Being in Nothingness. And it opens up. It opens up their relationship, and it's a very thick book. It's got a lot of letters, and it's worth it. Any other issues?
Have you seen that YouTube interview, film clip of Simone in 1975 giving an interview in Paris with, I think it was the first television interview she ever gave, if not the only one. It goes on for about half an hour.
No, I haven't.
It's really fascinating. She's interviewed by somebody like Charlie Rose, a French equivalent to that. And she talks at some length about her intentions in writing The Second Sex. And it's very interesting, particularly in light of what's been happening today, how she obviously was very well aware of the importance that that book was going to have on future generations. So it's on YouTube is where I found it in preparation for tonight's talk.
Well, I'd like to see it. And there's another thing about Simone's book, The Second Sex, I think is worth mentioning. One chapter she starts, I am woman. Now, whoever wrote that song, I am woman, hear me roar, your number's too big to ignore, I wouldn't doubt it a bit that they got it reading Simone. And she's influenced, not everybody, but a lot of women. And as the song says, I try to make my brother understand, as did she. And some do, and some don't. Yes, sir.
Did Sartre ever discuss existentialism and the Big Bang Theory?
Well, it all started with a Big Bang.
So does existence precede essence?
I think, well, that concept, Sartre would buy. It did all start with a Big Bang because he didn't think God created the world. It was just there. Now, I don't agree with him, but that's what he thought.
You know, but I'd like to say something. The Big Bang Theory was actually formulated by a priest, a Catholic priest who was a physicist. And the Catholic priest actually won an award from the Pope for having so that actually, the Big Bang has nothing to do with religion. The Big Bang has to do with the physics of existence. So it's not, so many people who are atheists think that is an atheistic theory, but it is not. And so you can look it up, the Big Bang was by a group,
Yeah.
and who happened to be a geophysicist. And actually,
Good point.
the idea of the fluctuating universe, which, oh gosh, the British philosopher who was an anti-deist completely, I can't think of his brain right now.
Bertrand Russell?
No, it was the other guy.
Whitehead?
No, not Whitehead, no, I'll think of it. But he actually said, no, so the two big theories at the time, physical theories, were the fluctuating universe and the Big Bang. And then the Big Bang turned out actually, Einstein said, the mathematics were right, and it was accepted as a theory. And the British philosopher, whose name I'm not thinking of right now, was so mad, he actually derided it by calling it wasn't Russell, by calling it the Big Bang. So that actually was a point of derision. A lot of people said, hey, that's right.
That's good. That's very good. Oh, another book I do recommend to you, Irrational Man, a study of existential philosophy. Now there are several different existentialists, but there's a chapter on Sartre in here. And frankly, it's easier than understanding being and nothingness. But it does explain the fundamentals. In fact, being in itself and being for itself, I read it both in Being and Nothingness and in this. And this is easier to grasp. Okay. I know I'm supposed to go on till 7:30, but if you'd like to stay and chat, I'll be here. But if there are no other questions, as Mr. Spock would say, live long and prosper.